Good morning, KCGC viewers. I am Dr. Preetinder Kaur, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Khalsa College of Law, Amritsar. Today I am going to discuss politics of climate change. Global warming is one of the single environmental and humanitarian crises faced by the humanity. It is an international issue affecting each and every nation all over the globe. The issue has caught the attention of scholars in 70s and 80s when it was pointed out that global warming or greenhouse gases emitted in the wake of industrialization has assumed dangerous proportions. Global warming refers to increase in Earth's atmospheric temperature due to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The major greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, halocarbons, chlorofluorocarbons, etc. According to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the natural factors such as volcanic eruptions, solar variations, etc., which has caused most of the global warming in the pre-industrial era has receded in the background, and anthropogenic activities such as burning of fossil fuels, industrial pollutants, and deforestation took as the major culprits. The concentrations of carbon dioxide were 280 parts per million in pre-industrial era, which according to the latest reports has risen up to 480 parts per million, which is a drastic increase in the recent times. So according to IPCC's latest report, the carbon budget available with the globe is 2,900 billion tons of carbon dioxide, out of which 1,900 billion tons of carbon dioxide has already been used by the nations. And major share was contributed by the developed nations. The various initiatives have been taken in this regard to deal with the issue of global warming, but success on this front has been eluding due to the differences in viewpoint of the developed and the developing nations. One of the major environmental agreement on climate change was Kyoto Protocol, concluded in 1997. Under this agreement, it was made obligatory for the industrialized countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions to the tune of 5.2% with the level of 1990 by 2005. But most of the industrialized nations were not happy with the conditions or with the targets set by this agreement. They are of the view that both the developed and the developing nations should be under obligation to deal with the issue. The exemption granted to the developing countries, which is categorized as non-Annex countries, was not acceptable to the Annex 1 countries, that is the developed countries. Whereas the developing countries, or we can say the non-Annex countries, they argue that the developed nations have adopted the path of industrialization much earlier, and in the wake of industrialization, they have contributed or emitted large amount of greenhouse gases in the environment. Therefore, the responsibility of historical greenhouse gas emissions released by the developed nations lies on them. Therefore, it is obligatory for developed nations to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. The developed countries, they argue that the burden of emission reductions should be shared on equal footing, and they demand absolute emission reduction targets. Whereas the developing nations, they are of the view that per capita approach should be followed while calculating the emission reductions. When we say per capita approach, it means the total emissions of a country divided by its population. But whereas the developed nations, they do not endorse to this viewpoint. They are of the view that the per capita approach will provide advantageous position to the developing countries or fast developing countries like India and China. But the developed countries, they want the emissions to be calculated on absolute terms. The developed nations argue that the per capita approach will reward the overpopulated nations. It will lead to extra burden on the already depleting resources of the world. Another major agreement concluded in this regard was Copenhagen Accord in 2019. This accord has blurred the distinction or division between the industrialized and unindustrialized nations, as it has asked the nations to reduce their emission reductions irrespective of being developed or developing. Another major agreement in this regard was concluded in 2015, that was Paris Agreement. Under Paris Agreement, the nations were asked to represent their intended nationally determined contributions, that is INDCs, which means they have to voluntarily pledge reduction targets, and at the same time they have to mention how they will achieve their targets and how they find their emission reduction targets as fair and according to their contribution. Under this, India, though being a developing economy, has pledged to reduce its emission reduction targets by 33 to 35% of its emissions by 2030 with the level of 2005. At the same time, another developing country, that is China, has committed to achieve the maximum hike in by 2030, and in a way to return to cut down its emissions by 60 to 65%. On the other hand, USA, being one of the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has pledged to reduce 26 to 28% of its greenhouse gas emissions on an average by 2020. But the politics of global warming still continues. The major culprit or the major contributor to greenhouse gases was never satisfied with any of the agreements. If we talk about the Kyoto Protocol concluded in 1997, though the Bill Clinton, the then president of USA at that USA, he signed the Kyoto Protocol, but he never presented it for ratification in front of Senate. In 2001, Bush refused to sign Kyoto Protocol. He denied it on the pretext that it has exempted 80% of the world population from emission reduction targets, and only 20% of the global population, that is the industrializations, were under obligation to reduce their emissions, which is an unfair practice. Then again, at Paris Agreement, there was a little hope among the environmentalists or among the negotiators that USA is participating in the agreement, or it has a positive response towards the agreement. But the success of any agreement was seen as dependent on US participation, because USA being a major culprit in greenhouse gas emissions, therefore its participation is must for the success of any agreement. If we talk about Kyoto Protocol in 1997, though the Bill Clinton has signed the Kyoto Protocol, but he never presented it for ratification in Senate. In 2001, the Bush, he rejected the agreement on this pretext that it has put obligations on only 20% of the world population and exempted 80% of the population on being developing countries. So it is an unfair and fatally flawed agreement. So though in 2015, it was hoped that USA participation will obviously lead to success to this agreement. Obama had decided to reduce, or he has announced to reduce 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. Mr. Obama has unveiled clean power plan to make the power plants renewable, or to lessen their reliability on fossil fuels. In 2015, USA pledged to reduce its emissions to the tune of 26 to 28%. But the then President Donald Trump, he After assuming the office, he refused to abide by the conditions of the Paris Agreement. He termed the climate agreement, or he termed the global warming as a hoax perpetuated by developing countries, especially China, to render the manufacturing hub of USA as incompetent or ineffective. Therefore, he never wanted to be a part of the agreement. But according to Article 28 of the Paris Agreement, no nation can withdraw from the agreement before 3 years, completion of the 3 years of its ratification. So after the completion of 3 years, the nation has to give a 1 year prior notice. Therefore, the process of leaving or putting out of the agreement started in November 2019, and the process completed on 4th November 2020, on the very next day of the presidential elections. So therefore, he never wanted to be a part of the agreement. But his successor, Joe Biden, he was a firm believer, or he was a supporter of climate. His successor, Joe Biden, was in favor of providing solution to the problem of global warming. He, after assuming the office, has decided to re-enter or to rejoin the agreement. He even proposed, or he even pledged to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. So this was seen as a positive attempt on part of President Joe Biden. He even encouraged other international players to increase or to go above or go beyond the nationally intended emission reduction targets. So at last, we can conclude that no agreement or no climate agreement would be successful without the participation of the major culprits or the major emitters. Therefore, the participation of all the nations, irrespective of being developed or developing, is required. So because no nation alone has contributed to this problem, and therefore no nation alone can solve this problem. Thank you.